Welcome to the Best Practices Language Impaired, excuse me, update to Policy 2419. As far as my ASHA disclosure, this session has been approved for ASHA CEUs. If you watch it after this session, you will still get CEUs. There's information at the end for that, and I don't have any other financial relationships to disclose. This is our agenda for today. We're just going to be talking about proposed, not proposed anymore, actually, the changes for the language impairment, eligibility, and diagnostic criteria. That will be our focus. So we'll give you as always, the attendance link and certificate information in the chat box at the end of the presentation. We have been talking about this change for, I think, close to 5 years now. And in that, we've talked about the fact that we needed to change the way we did language eligibility, and that time is now. Just a reminder that the board did approve Policy 2419, and it will be in effect on November 14th. Excuse me, until then, the 2017 policy 2419 remains in effect. Anytime there's a change, there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be upset, but there's also going to be a chance. And this is going to be our chance to do what we're supposed to be doing as educational speech language pathologists, and that is support all students who have adverse impact of their speech and language disorder on their educational performance. And just a reminder that that can include not only academic performance, but their vocational or social communicative performance. I usually go into the story about Sears and video stores and taxis, but I think you can get the point just hearing those names, even the fact that those entities didn't change with the times, didn't update their offerings when other things were coming along and when things were changing in the world. And because of that, there aren't any more Sears. You don't see video stores anymore, and taxis are definitely an anomaly, except maybe around airports still and hotels. Um, we had a lot of change, and I'm just so sorry that everything happened at once with online IEP. I know that's been a struggle for everyone. Our SLP guidance document is changing. There was a question posted in our leads group today when that's going to be out. We're hoping it will be released the week of the 14th of November. But because there are some dates in between there that our graphics department is not in, not at work because of holidays, we'll get it to as close to that week as possible. Policy 2419 changed, and then we're going to be having new process forms as well that go along with the policy changes. So it's kind of like, I'm sure, because it feels like that to us too, that it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose. It's just information overload. And so that's one of the reasons that we've decided to go ahead and with our changes, do some recordings, individuals for each each area of eligibility, and provide some support that way. So if you can't take it all in at once, because I don't think anybody could, you can go back and listen again. You can look through the information, and we'll be sending you pieces of information from the guidance document up until the point that the document is ready, because, I know everybody's anxious to see it. So you'll get drafted information until that document is ready. As always, with everything that we do, and everything that anyone does who works in special ed, you have to be flexible. And I just ask for your patience and flexibility as we go through this information today. This is just a short, I think it's 3-minute video, but I think it's really important to kind of set the mindset that you have as we start listening to this. So we're going to take the time to listen to it very quickly.
Hi and welcome to another video blog. What I want to talk to you about today is how you can get yourself into a situation where you're a person who thrives on change rather than just change. What's the difference? Thriving means that your overall sense of well-being, fulfillment, success and happiness is positively improved by change versus threatened or jeopardised, and that's what we mean by survive. For this to happen, we need the right behaviours when change is occurring, and for the right behaviours we need the right mindset. If we're just surviving change, it means we've got a fixed mindset. Whereas if we're going to thrive during change, it means we need what's called a growth mindset. Now let me explain what both of those mean. When we have a growth mindset, we're open to change, and we believe that we've got the potential to change. A growth mindset suspends judgment. It is unbiased. It's objective. It's reflective. We're curious. We're optimistic, and we have a future focused. All of these things are then going to bring the right behaviours when change happens. On the other hand, without even realising, we may have a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset's where we're closed off to change, often without even realising it. We have a fear of change. We're judgmental or quick to judge. We're biased, dismissive, cynical, avoidant, and we get caught in the past. All of these things are going to drive the behaviours that's going to make it difficult for us to thrive in change. So the next thing we need to think about is the nature of the change ahead. And we need to think about this in two ways. First is the speed of the change, and whether the change that's coming is going to be gradual or rapid. And the next is the size of the change. Is it going to be small or big? This will then have a big impact on the types of behaviours we're going to need to thrive rather than survive. If our mindset is fixed, the change is gradual and small, we're going to be very complacent. If, however, the change is small but rapid, we're going to be resistant. On the other hand, if the change is gradual but big, we're going to be dismissive. Okay? And most worrying of all, if the change is big and rapid, we're going to be rigid. So here are the behaviours that allow us to thrive because we bring a growth mindset. Okay? If the change is small and gradual, we're going to be curious. Okay? If it's small and rapid, we're going to be flexible. Flip side, if the change is gradual and big, we're going to be studious. And best of all, if the change is big and rapid, we're going to be agile. And agile is what's going to allow us to thrive during times of change. So in short, what is it that we want and don't want? We want to make sure that we're not being complacent, resistant, dismissive, and rigid. These things come from a fixed mindset. Alternatively, what we do want is we want to be curious, flexible, studious, and agile. And these things come from a growth mindset. And the growth mindset will allow us to thrive.
So here we go. We're going to talk about the proposed, actually, like I said, they're not proposed anymore, the changes for language impairment. For the eligibility criteria, we changed the eligibility category title to speech or language impairment from speech/language impairment. We moved all speech language charts, resources, and developmental norm information from the appendices in the Policy 2419 to the Speech Language Pathology Services guidance document. That means that as things are updated, as things change, as new research comes out, we'll be able to change it more frequently than we could with policy, which is a much larger process as far as making changes. And we also reorganized all the speech or language impairment eligibility criteria to correlate with the three prongs of eligibility. And I want to explain one of the reasons we did that. As you know, policy went out for comment, and we had 313 comments on policy. Many of those comments were about the speech language impaired sections, and I was thankful for that because we had made things a little too complicated in some areas, and there were some things that needed to be changed. But one of the things that was brought out in the comments was that SLPs know when a student needs therapy. They don't need to do a comprehensive assessment. They don't need any other evaluations to determine when a child needs support. And unfortunately, that's just not how IDEA and Policy 2419 work. Because we are educational speech language pathologists, we have to adhere to the guidelines set by IDEA and Policy 2419. And the guideline for eligibility is the three prongs. And as I've gone out and done trainings in counties, these last several, well, I guess since school started, um, I always ask, what are the three prongs of eligibility? And honestly, one or two people potentially know in a county, but for the most part, no one can tell me. And that's what you should be considering every single time you place a child in therapy. So we reorganized everything to make it fit with those three prongs. We added summary assessment forms for speech sound disorders, language disorders, child onset fluency disorder, and voice disorders. We did not add one for social communication disorder, but that doesn't mean that we won't add one later. And we have comprehensive assessments are expected for all 5 areas of eligibility. And we'll go into that in just a little bit, but that just means you're going to have to do more than your tests that you've been traditionally using. A lot of people interpreted that on the comments and policy, and I can understand that because of the way the first question or language, I mean, the first requirement under language was listed. But some people took that to mean that we're expecting you to do up to 4 language evaluation standardized tests. That is not what a comprehensive assessment is. We'll go into those pieces, but you're going to see that it's much more than just those standardized tests. When we talk about the components of comprehensive assessments, we're going to be looking at these 4 areas. Um, we've done this in the past, and but we have not done a thorough investigation of these areas in the green. That's what's going to make it more comprehensive, because knowing what's happening with the student in their academic activities and based on their academic tests and measures, that is going to give us the information we need to write the goals, to know what to address for those students that's happening in the classroom. Instead of just using a couple of standardized measures or norm reference tests that have nothing to do with what's going on in the classroom. They're decontextualized, and just picking out the errors that they had on those tests and writing goals on those discrete skills, which here again have nothing to do with what's going on in the classroom. So as we think about it, these 4 components are what you're going to have to consider. And these 4 components also correlate to the areas on the assessment summaries that we just talked about. So the first part, the green part, is where you're going to get your information for academic impact. And you're going to be able to look at academic activities, and that might include work sample analysis or portfolios, curriculum-based assessments, observation. As we had a team of lead SLPs working with me this summer on the guidelines, and when we were talking, when we mentioned observation, they honestly said, I mean, they were being honest. And, when I think about it, when I used to do observations too, sometimes I felt like I wasn't getting that much information from them, but they were just a requirement that I had to do. But now I'm hoping that with some structure and with some support from observation forums that you can choose or not choose to use as you do observations, that's what's going to tell you what's happening in that classroom. And without being in there and seeing it, it's going to be hard at times for you to distinguish what's going on and what the weak areas are. Educational records and MTSS data, if they've gone through the SAP process, that kind of thing, all of that information can be very, very helpful for you. We're also going to talk about academic tests and measures, and that's going to be looking at statewide assessments and DIBELS, benchmark testing, norm reference measures of academic achievement if they've been tested in the past for, let's say for, suspected learning disability. That's all information that could give you some potential guidance as far as what that academic impact is, and better, what's causing it. Um, as we've talked about this, I really do listen to the feedback that you guys give. And, one person was telling me that, I think this piece is intimidating sometimes, or at least uncomfortable, maybe not intimidating, but uncomfortable for SLPs because this isn't something you've done before, looking at this academic information this closely. But you have a really good resource that's going to be able to help you with that very quickly, and that is your classroom teacher. You're going to be able to go in and say, can I see work samples? If they have a written language sample that the teacher shows you, you can upload that to the Salad Lab and have it analyzed. If the teacher says the student's performing with all their peers, they're all on this, the student's on the same level as his peers, that gives you academic information. Now, that you'll see on the language summary assessment will help guide where you circle that they are on that form. But I don't want you to let that fear of being able to analyze work samples keep you from talking to that classroom teacher, figuring out what's going on with them. If they've had some MTSS support, then that would give you a lot of information about things that were tried, how quickly they learned it, maybe what areas they couldn't, correct in, and that kind of thing, so that you'll have some information to really help determine how they're doing academically. The other part of the puzzle of the comprehensive assessment is your speech language probes and your speech language tests and measures. And those are all things that you already do. You know how to do these. You don't have to be trained to do them. We are going to provide some support for you with some training webinars, some abbreviated ones. But honestly, this is what you do. This is what you've been trained to do. So with this, you're going to look at case histories. These are some of the probes you can use. Case histories, unless it's a birth to 3 student, you probably don't have access to that information, but some of that information can be very, very helpful. So, being able to send home a case history form and have it come back can provide you, a more comprehensive picture of the child. Same thing with interviews. You can not only interview the parent, but the teacher and the student. If the student is old enough to participate in an interview, you can interview them and get information from them about that.
Leanne,
Language samples.
Speaking of teachers, Vicki Holstein wanted to know if the teacher evaluation form will probably change.
The teacher evaluation forms are not forms that we do here. They're forms that the county selects, I think. And if you guys remember, as a matter of fact, in Kanawha County, you guys have a separate teacher evaluation form that you do use for speech students that you can use. So we have in our leads group some sample teacher evaluation reports. We'll be glad to share those. The leads have access to them, but as far as I know, those forms are ones that are county specific. But all of our process forms that need to change due to the eligibility will be changing. Okay, where was I? Sorry. Let's see. Language sample, narrative and narrative language samples. Those are considered probes, so you can use your own if you prefer to do your own and analyze them. You can send them to the Salad Lab, but those language samples provide a lot of great information. Um, we have Karen Haynes working on some really short videos for us to talk about how to get those reports and then find the information you need for determining what you need to work on with that student. Because some of the reports can be a little overwhelming, I think, when you first look at them. So we'll have that support for you. Stimulability, you guys know how to do stimulability changing. And these probes, these components are related to all areas that you'll be doing assessments for, not just language. So you'll see some of these things again and again. Dynamic assessment, we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Some people have been kind of concerned that they're not sure what a dynamic assessment is, but you guys do it all the time. So we'll be talking about that. Play-based therapy for those kids who are in preschool and just can't participate in a test with you. Play-based therapy can provide all kinds of information. And then, of course, criterion reference tests and checklists. Those are all considered probes. Um, Speech language tests and measures. Those are the norm reference tests that we're used to doing. Um, and you can also have those for specific areas like, artic, language, semantics, syntax. So those are all the components that are going to go together to give you the big picture, the comprehensive picture about what the student is doing. And this is just a graphic to show you how those correlate. So all that diagnostic information that you get from the blue areas, that's going to tell you whether or not they have the impairment or the disorder. All the information you get from the green areas is going to tell you whether there's an adverse impact. And then the need for specially designed instruction. And it's really important for you to think about that prong too, because if there are some students that you could serve with steps, or if you could train a teacher and they could provide support for the student all day long, um, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they need your specific skill set to be able to do the work. So for eligibility for language disorder, the changes, we added the updated categorization terminology of form, use, and content to the diagnostic criteria definition. We updated the onset of language disorder to include not only the early developmental period, but when academic language demands in the classroom increase. And we added the use of a functional communication summary for students who can't participate in this assessment process. We simplified the description of acceptable diagnostic accuracy. What we had in the draft that went out was way too complicated. I apologize for that. We realized after it went out that it was very cumbersome and not very clear. So we've clarified that, and we updated statements at the beginning of the eligibility criteria section. And it's supposed to say, what it says now is following consideration of the child's age, culture, language background, or dialect. We added socioeconomic status, and it didn't make it into the document for some reason. So that's going to be clarified in the SLP guidance document. It didn't make it into the section on the 2419 update. This is the information on the diagnostic criteria where we use the form, use, and content, and we added function. There are have been questions about pragmatics, and that goes under the function section. So we can provide pragmatic therapy for students with autism using a language impairment to diagnose, eligibility. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Onset of symptoms may be evident, like we said, when academic um, demands become higher. This was supposed to have been added. This will be in the guidance document and is an important thing for us to remember when we're determining whether or not a student needs therapy. Everything that we did in this section, we tried to leave it up to the SLP's judgment, professional judgment, because you're going to determine which pieces of the comprehensive assessment components to address for each individual student. So as you're looking at this, just remember you're the one who's going to decide everything that happens with a student for these three pieces. It says 3 or more speech language probes or standardized speech language assessments. And remember the probes that counts, those 2 blue areas, can be performed as part of a comprehensive language evaluation. If the student can't participate in the assessment process, consider the use of the functional communication assessment summary, and we will be looking at that. A student with a language disorder exhibits at least 3 of the following: It does not mean that you can only use 3. It means you have to use at least 3. Assessment on a composite norm reference test of both receptive and expressive language with a diagnostic accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity of 80% or higher. And honestly, sometimes I think this is confusing because I've been seeing posts in the um, lead SLPs me Teams group, and it's because of misunderstanding things I think sometimes that are written, but I just want to make sure this is very clear that when we're talking about the diagnostic accuracy and the specificity and sensitivity, it's 80% is what we're looking for with both of those scores. And you'll see why that's going to be appropriate in a minute. So we're looking at 80% for that, but that doesn't have anything to do with the required cut score. Um, there's no required cut score. It's the cut score that matches what the test publisher recommended to be the cut score. So instead of having our 78 that we've always had as our standard score that we had to have on that diagnostic test, now we're saying that it has to have a good diagnostic accuracy, at least 80%. Some are going to be higher, but at least 80%, because that's what we found out as part of the thing we've been doing incorrectly. We've been assuming that all tests are created equal, and they're not. And so as they have gone through the standardization process, each test company determines what the cut score is for their test and which one accurately shows when a student has a disability. And these tests weren't designed for determining disability anyway. They were designed to determine maybe if a student had a disorder or if they were delayed, but nobody ever designed these tests to determine disabilities. That's the reason we have to be so careful, and we have to do more than just testing. And it definitely have to do more than just one test. IDEA says you can't rely on just one test. So the test recommended cut score can be different for each test. And that's the reason we have a test card that we'll look at in just a minute. So that's one option. You can do a composite norm reference test, but you have to use the composite test scores. You can't use individual subtest scores for this piece. Language sample analysis results in a standard score of 1.5 standard deviations, and you're looking at productivity and complexity. And Karen Haynes is talking about that specifically in the short videos that she's doing for us. Another option out of the 5 is dynamic assessment, and that's the test, teach, retest model that demonstrates limited or very limited improvement. And that there's information about that in the guidance document. But I think one thing to remember is there's no dynamic assessment for you to go pick up and use. What you're going to be doing is picking out things that you think are weak areas that you've either observed in the classroom, that the teacher has told you are weak areas that you've picked up on the testing that you've done. And that's what you try to see if you can teach them um, something, and then if they can do it after that. Or it's like testing for a stimulability. If they learn it easily, then you know it's not a language disorder. It's more of a language difference or a delay. But that information is very, very helpful, especially for those students who are English learners, because so many times if they miss an item on a test, we say they missed it, assuming they don't know it. But a lot of times if you do a dynamic assessment, they can pick it up pretty quickly. Now, one of the comments that we received when we did the policy on comment was that they wanted a score, a specific score. Everybody wants specifics for everything, and I get that. But with a dynamic assessment, there's no score that you get on that. You'll notice on the video that we're going to listen to from Asha about dynamic assessment, it says if they haven't gotten it after 2 or 3 sessions. So that can kind of be your guidelines. But if you're talking about SLP's judgment, you're going to be able to figure out pretty quickly whether they're stimulable for this language skill, whatever it is, or not. And that's going to help support your recommendations. D is a little tricky because what we did was we wanted to be able to use some of those specific tests, like test of pragmatic language, or some of those specific tests that don't, um, or semantics test or something that doesn't test. It's not a composite test of receptive and expressive language, because some of those tests are appropriate. But we didn't want to just use those tests alone, because if we did, we're right back to where we were using tests that don't meet diagnostic accuracy. So to use this one, to use, further testing, you have to use it in conjunction with item A, which is the one that meets the composite norm reference test that meets the 80% diagnostic accuracy. And for a lot of your kids, you're going to be able to do that. A lot of your kids, you can give those tests to, and those are your two of your three items. The fifth one to choose from is like case history, observation, parent-teacher interviews, and informal assessment. And just remember that you're looking for social interaction or educational progress, and how it's affected, except for preschool, which is social communicative impact. Okay, so since we've reorganized it to meet the three prongs of to match the three prongs of eligibility, number 2 is adverse impact. And there's the social communicative performance in case of preschoolers again. And the student needs special education. And we did not change these. Language disorder is not considered primary when there's hearing or other impairments that more appropriately define the eligibility category, and it can be a related or primary service. When I mentioned the test card, the assessment card, we had WVU do a card for us um, that lets you know exactly what the diagnostic accuracy is. So it tells you have to use the composite scores. So that's overall test score. And like, for instance, with the self, it says the sensitivity is 90, specificity is 97, specificity is 97. So that meets the 80 sensitivity specificity guideline. The cut score that you use to determine if the student has a disorder is 80 instead of the 78. So if you think about it, if we've been using the self and we've been using, the self 5, and we used our 78 score, our arbitrary 78 score, then we've missed some kids who've come through. We haven't picked them up because they didn't have that 78 score. So that's the reason these cut scores are important. As we were looking through some things the other day and trying to find some support information for some of the tests, we found out that some of the information here needs to be updated. So we're just double checking that. But this will be available for you to print out as a booklet that has all the information in it. We have information on most of the tests that I think that you have in your test battery. So that will be able to let you look at it and see the sensitivity and specificity of some of the tests that you've been using. This is just some of the research that supports the language sample analysis. One of the things that was mentioned when I was reviewing the comments from the comment period for the policy was somebody said that language sample analysis was done years ago. It's an old type thing to use, and it's not appropriate any longer. Well, I just wanted to show that there is current research that shows that it is appropriate. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the most reliable predictors of language disorders and language difficulties. So I think sometimes I'm definitely really feeling that the old part of the of the equation now. And so I just want you to know this is current research, current information, and it does give a lot of good information that you can use not only for determining eligibility, but for providing therapy. And for those students who are language learners, it's considered the gold standard. So whenever anyone asks me what to do for a student that they have to evaluate who has a second language, I always recommend using language sample analysis, and you can do spoken and written. WVU can analyze them and give you some really good information to show whether or not the student has a learning difference or a learning disability. And the correlation between narrative comprehension and reading comprehension, writing, and social achievement is very important too. This is just some information, updated information about the Salad Lab. They are in the School of Medicine now, so if you have the old website, it doesn't say School of Medicine or something on it, then you've got the wrong one. And it'll say that they're not doing it anymore. So make sure you have the right one. And they have a resources library there as well that we have, paid for, so they can ship it out to you if you want to try some new materials. One of the best therapy materials out there right now for language skills is the Story Champs set. Because that's how therapy is being recommended now, to do a narrative approach instead of working on isolated skills like plurals and that kind of thing. So they have some those language materials. They also develop some iPad resources that you can check out. And, if you haven't used that website yet, please check it out. They've hired extra staff, and they are, prepared for your influx of language samples. There are how-to videos on the website that will tell you exactly what to do, how to upload, that kind of thing. And we are going to we've had the request from many people wanting to be able to do this themselves, wanting to be able to learn how to do this so they don't have to rely on WVU. And I understand that and support that. So we will be looking at trying to do something like that in the spring. So I don't think this tool is going to go away, the language sample analysis. So the sooner you start embracing it and trying to use it, I think the better off you're going to be. This is a video from ASHA about dynamic assessment. Let me see how long it is. I'm going to go ahead and let me see, what time is it? 2012. I'm not going to show this because I think it's 18 minutes. Let me see for sure. Oh, it's 11 minutes. We'll watch it. We've got time then.
Hi, I'm Liz Pena, and I'm going to be talking about dynamic assessment today. So what is dynamic assessment? First, my speaker disclosure is that I am a professor and associate dean of faculty development and diversity at the University of California at Irvine, and I'm receiving compensation from the American Speech and Hearing Association for this module. So today we're going to talk about how we compare dynamic assessment to other dynamic assessment approaches, or to other assessment approaches. We're going to talk about what makes dynamic assessment dynamic, and what we should use as the dynamic assessment pre-test and post-test. Also, we're going to consider how dynamic assessment differs from assessments including standardized assessment, observations, and response to intervention. Some overlap, but there are some differences as well. So what makes dynamic assessment dynamic? Well, one of the things that makes it dynamic is that the focus is more on the learning process rather than on how kids perform on a standardized test or a probe. So it's really important to be observant of what children are doing during that learning. We look at the amount and nature of the examiner investment. So how hard did somebody have to work to get that kid to make some changes? It's very interactive, so you make decisions in the moment about what might help the child perform at a higher level. And we're really focused on the process rather than on child outcomes. In terms of selecting a test, what you want to do is select a probe or a measure that really samples the language skills of interest. We want it to be something that is sensitive to short-term changes. So a lot of examples of a certain kind of item, for example, might be a better way of probing a child language skill than a broad-based measure. And we want to be able to capture emerging knowledge and performance. So it's not, I want to be able to rate something on like a scale. Is it close to the target? Is it exactly the target? Is it completely different from the target? So that helps us to capture what children are learning in a very short amount of time. So how do dynamic assessment approaches differ from other approaches? Well, here's a chart that shows a summary of some of these. So for standardized assessment or static assessment, participants are passive. So you go in, you test, and you're not supposed to interfere with the child's performance or with the child's answers. You're not supposed to cue them. So the examiner has a very neutral stance on what they're doing. The examiner's role is to really observe what the child can do pretty independently. Standardized tests are also used to describe needs or areas of difficulty, and it's given in a really standardized way so that you give that measure the same way every time you give it to a different child. In dynamic assessment, it's a little bit different. So both the child and the examiner are really active, and the examiner is actively participating and intervening and supporting the child learning during that language assessment. So you're watching and hypothesizing and then getting in there and trying to make that child's performance a little bit better. The goal is to describe modifiability or how the child can change. And so the protocol is really flexible and adaptable. So you have permission to go off script and to make hypotheses about what you think the child's needs are, try to do a mini support for that process or that procedure, and then see how they do with that. So how is dynamic assessment different from observation? So observation is a really important aspect of assessment, but in observation, usually examiners are more neutral. So you're kind of in the room, observing, watching, and developing hypotheses about what happens and why that happens, and it helps you to compare performance across contexts. In dynamic assessment, that examiner is going to be more active, and so they may get into the child's space to intervene to try to help the child perform better on a specific linguistic task. So that's one difference from observation. How is dynamic assessment different from response to intervention? And response to intervention, I think, has a lot of similarities to dynamic assessment. So we look at child responsiveness in both, we look at child learning in both, we want to document intervention that leads to change in both, and we look at outcomes in both. But where they differ is in the approach. So dynamic assessment starts with testing and then teaching and retesting. In response to intervention, the focus is more on teaching and then testing and then reteaching. In terms of the number of sessions, dynamic assessment uses relatively few sessions. So you're just trying to look at emerging knowledge or ability to change, and you do it in 1, 2, or 3 sessions typically. Response to intervention is usually over several weeks, so 10 weeks, 15 weeks, a whole semester. And so you're looking at whether children are retaining that information and using the information that they're learning. Dynamic assessment can be used or is typically used in special education to determine whether a child has a language impairment or a developmental language disability. And RTI is used as a tiered intervention within the regular education domain. And then the focus is a little bit different. In dynamic assessment, we look at what works and why it works that way. And in response to intervention, we're looking at what tier or what level of support works best for that child. So now we've explored the concept of dynamic assessment, and in the next activity, we're going to review some examples of these concepts. So what is dynamic assessment? Let's review some examples. So here we have a girl, Vicky. She's 6 years old and she's in the 1st grade. Her teacher referred her to the speech language pathologist because she's concerned about her language and literacy skills. The speech language pathologist gives her the test of narrative language. The scores indicate difficulty with narrative comprehension and narrative production. What is this? So this is an example of a static test. So it's a standardized test. The examiner administers the test according to the manual, same way that you would give it to any child, and you score the stories and the questions, and you obtain a standardized score for comprehension and for production, and then like a more comprehensive score as well. And this score helps us to determine whether the child has a developmental language disability. Next, SLP might observe Vicky during reading instruction, and she notices that Vicky has difficulty decoding words. So here, the speech is doing an observation. So through these observations, she's able to make hypotheses about Vicky's instructional needs that are based on observations, that are based on what she sees in the classroom setting. Next, we find out that Vicky tests in the lowest quartile on a reading test, and the school recommends Vicky for the early interventions in reading program that's focused on letter sound knowledge, reading fluency, and curricular vocabulary. And so this is a standard curriculum that's a tier 2 curriculum. And after 16 weeks, she's going to be retested to see if she's on target for reading. So this is an example of response to intervention. The 16-week program is a 2-tier intervention that's focused on getting Vicky's skills up to speed. And then the SLP notices also that Vicky's TNL stories are not well organized. And so the SLP works on stories that include elements to include a problem statement, an attempt, and a resolution. She observes and reports on Vicky's strategies during that teaching session and the kinds of supports that she needs to improve her stories. And this is an example of dynamic assessment. So the focus is on the process of learning and what the child needs in order to make changes in her story. So in the next 5 minutes, what you need to do, or what is planned for you to do, is your turn to practice. So here's a plan statement. So what you want to think about: the who, the what, and the how. And think about a child that you're currently testing or have tested recently. Is there a diagnostic question that you can answer using dynamic assessment? What is the focus of the concern, and what are your hypotheses regarding how best to support learning in this area? And then how can you test this out using principles of dynamic assessment? Let's try your plan. So spend 5 minutes at work putting your plan into action. So dynamic assessment can be really powerful to determine what works, what doesn't work, why a child might be having difficulty, and you use the dynamic assessment to test that out. If you don't have somebody that you're working with right now that this could work for, maybe explain this process to a colleague. How can they use dynamic assessment to differentiate between language difference and language disorder? And here you might jot down some reflections. What went well in your plan? What happened? How can you make improvement? So think about what your teaching target was. How did you test and retest? What was the child's response to that teaching? What did they pick up on? What was difficult? What else do you need to know to make a diagnostic decision? How does it inform your testing?
Okay. Well, I hope that that video was helpful. And this is part of a series produced by Asha, and Dr. Pena does all of them. So check it out. It's free on YouTube. Um, this is just some information about criterion reference tests and how they're used. And they're, we know that they're based on pass fail or age guidelines and criteria, that kind of thing. This is the language assessment summary, top of the form that I wanted to go over with you very quickly. And one thing I want you to understand is this is not going to be a one and done for this. We're going to be supporting you through these changes. So take the time to, to look through this information and digest it. And then we'll go from there as far as trying to support and answer questions. But you can see that we've got the areas that we talked about as far as the components for the for the comprehensive assessment. And then we have, in those columns, we have descriptions. This row talks about no apparent impact. This row talks about minimal impact, and these descriptions are what you're going to read and determine which one really applies to your student and describes them. Whichever one it is, that's what you're going to circle. Let me see here. And this is the one for moderate and substantial. For the moderate and substantial impact, those areas, if you find kids that have descriptions in those areas, that's going to be where you're going to determine that somebody needs support from there for therapy. With the minimal or no impact, then you're not going to recommend therapy for that. But these are complete forms. I thought I had the slide in here that had the picture of the complete form, but you're just going to be able to look and look and circle. And with that, I think it's going to be helpful for you to show not only the parents, but the IEP team to help you determine whether or not a child qualifies for therapy. And that's what you're going to be using for each of the four areas. For those students who can't participate in the testing process, there's also the option of using the functional communication assessment summary. And you can see that it describes different types of things. It's going to be even though you're checking things here, it's going to be a more of narrative report format for you to use to determine if a child needs therapy. And hopefully this will be very helpful for those kids who come in who are nonverbal in preschool and that kind of thing. So you can go ahead and get them service and then start working on that AEC evaluation. So that just shows you an example of some of the things that are listed in that on that whole form. And like I said, we're hoping that's going to be helpful. This is just one more quick video. We are almost finished, and we'll get through this one, and then we'll see if you guys have any questions. Okay. Um, this video, we're going to be sending out on an email Monday, and also the Arctic one. So if you see those emails, um, you've participated in this session, and you have, if you watch the Arctic one, that'll be the same one. We're going to be sending out the training videos, and then the resources will be attached so that you can get familiar with them before the guidance document comes out. I'm sorry that it's not ready. We've been trying to do everything we can to get it ready, and make sure that everything we put in there has been vetted and research based. And we have gone through a lot of states guidance documents trying to make sure that ours is the best it can be. So in the meantime, we want to be able to share the new information with you, and that's how we're going to do it. We're also going to have a playlist on our YouTube channel with SLP guidance document and policy updates. So there'll be videos there too. You may not want to watch them all at one time, but they'll be there available for you whenever you're ready. Um, I know it's five, we have 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? I know that's a lot of information. Like I said, the water, drinking water from a fire hose, but we have been talking about this change coming for a long time. And honestly, I really was concerned about the language change, but I think most people are concerned about the speech sound disorder change. So make sure and watch that. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now.